Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, December 30th, 2022. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. No sign of peace in Ukraine as the new year approaches. So, this is kind of a summary I put together of kind of where we're at when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Specifically concerning U.S. involvement. Of course, that's my focus. But really the beginning, I just stressed that, after over 10 months of fighting between Russian and Ukrainian forces, there's no sign that this new year, 2023, will bring peace to Ukraine as the warring parties have radically different demands and the U.S. continues to escalate aid for Kiev and its role in the war. Just in general, the U.S. is increasing its involvement in this war. Right now, Ukrainian officials are demanding that Russia withdraw from all the territory it's captured and face war crimes tribunals before peace talks can even begin. I mean, just a complete non starter. While Russian officials say that they're open to talks, but they insist any peace deal must involve the territories they annexed in Ukraine joining the Russian Federation. And the only way Ukraine is likely going to be compelled to talk with Russia is if the U.S. leverages aid to push them to do so, as Ukraine is entirely reliant on U.S. aid, entirely reliant on Western aid, but specifically U.S. aid. I mean, the U.S. has by far spent more money on this war than any of its NATO allies. And now there was a glimmer of hope back in November when Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that this winter would provide a good opportunity for peace talks. But unfortunately, his view was not a popular one within the Biden administration. So Milley, who is the highest ranking member of the U.S. military, he said that the warring sides should seize the moment to achieve peace this winter. But after his comments, the U.S. reassured Ukraine that negotiations don't need to happen. And media reports said that other high-level officials, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, were against the idea of talks. And this is a phenomenon that we've seen before where you have the State Department, Blinken, who's supposed to be America's top diplomat, being more hawkish, than the military brass. Than even the Pentagon in general. From media reports, Lloyd Austin hasn't shown any sign that he's interested in peace, but there are reports that kind of the feeling within the Pentagon was at this time, maybe we should think about winding things down here. But the State Department and the National Security Council were against that, or against the idea of talks. It's very shameful. And the only time a peace deal seemed possible, I have to mention this in a summary like this. I know I go over this all the time, but it seemed like a deal was possible back in April. Russia and Ukraine held in-person talks in Istanbul. They followed that with virtual sessions. And based on a recent article in Foreign Affairs from Fiona Hill, of all people, former Trump administration official, total hawk. She said, based on conversations with multiple senior former U.S. officials, they said that Ukraine and Russia reached like a tentative peace deal that would have involved Russia pulling back to the 2014 lines. But that was discouraged by the West. Boris Johnson, who was the British prime minister at the time, went to Kiev and urged Zelensky not to negotiate. And according to a report in Ukrainian media, his visit was a major factor in the scuttling of negotiations. And what I think was really more revealing than anything was Turkey said later in April, this was a few weeks later, they said that some members of NATO wanted the war in Ukraine to continue, to make Russia weaker. And then just a couple days after Turkey said that, Lloyd Austin admitted that one of the U.S. goals in Ukraine was to weaken Russia. So while the U.S. has discouraged negotiations throughout the 10 months of war, the Biden administration has continued to escalate military aid. And so far, where we're at right now, Congress has authorized $112 billion in spending to support Ukraine. That money hasn't all been used yet. It's going to be dispersed over the next few months, this latest $45 billion weapons package. And in the latest escalation, the administration is going to be sending Ukraine Patriot missiles. The administration has still held off from sending Ukraine the longer range missiles, fighter jets, and advanced tanks that it seeks. But Biden is going to be under pressure to oblige Ukraine from Republicans, believe it or not, as they take control of the House. Now, there is significant dissent among GOP members, among a lot of House Republicans against this policy of arming Ukraine. And I don't want to dismiss that, but overall, Republicans still favor sending this aid, and Republican leadership is all in, and they've criticized the administration for not doing enough. Michael McCall, who is expected to lead the House Foreign Affairs Committee in this new Congress, he accused President Biden of slow walking military aid to Ukraine, saying that he should send them these more advanced weapons that they want to hit targets in Crimea. Of course, that risks a big escalation. Mitch McConnell has said similar things. So while they're calling for more aid, even some of these mainstream Republicans have said that they favor the idea of more transparency and oversight. But unfortunately, these calls for oversight are being used to justify a U.S. military presence in Ukraine. The Pentagon now acknowledges that it has a small number of personnel in the country for on-site weapons inspections, which are based at these personnel are based at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. And NBC News reported earlier in December that the Pentagon is mulling sending a small number of additional troops to track weapons, a plan that a former U.S. official called classic mission creep. And this report said that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin wanted to add more troops for oversight to ensure that there are experts in the country to help Ukraine use critical weapon systems. Well, that's hinting that they might be doing more than tracking weapons. And it, of course, reminds us of, the military advisors. That's how they got started in Vietnam. This is the way we're going here. And this small presence is the only U.S. military presence that's been acknowledged by the Pentagon. The Intercept reported in October that U.S. Special Operations Forces and CIA personnel are also in the country. The U.S. hasn't acknowledged that covert campaign. And as the U.S. is escalating its role in the war, the Pentagon has also shifted its view on Ukrainian attacks inside Russian territory. We know that the Pentagon is now tacitly endorsing Ukrainian attacks deep inside Russia, according to reporting from the Times, and based on the shift in rhetoric from the Biden administration, saying that Ukrainians can use the weapons however they want once they get them. And Asia Times reported that Ukrainian drones that hit Russian air bases deep inside Russia used U.S. satellite GPS data to hit their targets. Since those Ukrainian drone attacks took place, that was at the beginning of December, the Engels airfield in Russia, which is about 300 miles from the Ukrainian border, it houses Russian strategic bombers. It's come under another drone attack. So they're really ramping up these attacks, and it looks like with support from the Pentagon. And according to a report from Jack Murphy, I went over this. This was huge. It's gotten very little attention, of course. And again, this guy, Jack Murphy, he's an investigative journalist. He's a U.S. Army Special Operations veteran. Scott Horton and other people that I trust have vouched for him. He's not just going to make this up. He reported, citing unnamed former U.S. military and intelligence officials, that the CIA has been directing sabotage attacks inside Russia using an unnamed NATO country's intelligence services. So, of course, both the covert campaign inside Russia and the U.S.-backed Ukrainian attacks risk provoking a major escalation from Moscow. But U.S. officials are not as concerned with an escalation based only on the fact that up to this point, Russia has not responded to attacks on its territory with nuclear weapons or by attacking NATO countries. While U.S. officials aren't concerned by a nuclear escalation, experts have warned that the chance of nuclear war is greater today than at any time than during the Cold War. President Biden himself acknowledged that there is a risk of nuclear Armageddon. And Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, he's warned recently that a full-blown war between Russia and NATO is possible. But both men insist that the Western powers should continue supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia despite the risks, and 2023 will likely bring more dangerous escalations. So that's my little summary of where we're at for the end of the year. I hope it's not too redundant. I know I go over this stuff a lot, but that's that. And then the next article here. So this is actually kind of goodish news. This is from Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute. Russia receives U.S. assurances on Patriot missile deployment in Ukraine. So American soldiers will not operate Patriot missile batteries slated to be shipped to Ukraine. And this is according to the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, citing recent talks through diplomatic back channels. Moscow previously threatened to destroy the advanced air defense systems should they reach the battlefield. I'm sure they still plan on destroying them, but at least it doesn't look like they're going to be deployed with U.S. troops, because that was a concern because they're so advanced. But it seems like they have plans to train Ukrainians on them. Training could take up to 6 months. Another example of the long-term planning that the U.S. is doing here. So Lavrov, he detailed rare discussions between U.S. and Russian officials during an interview on Wednesday, saying his country had received assurances that Patriots sent to Kiev will not be accompanied by U.S. personnel. So he said that they were told, I'm just going to read what he said. He said, quote, "We asked the Americans via the channels that our embassy still has whether the decision to send Patriot systems to Ukraine means that American specialists will be there as well, considering the complexity of operation of these systems. We were told at length that this is not being planned specifically because the Americans do not and will not fight against Russia directly. The Patriot systems will be deployed within several months as Ukrainian servicemen familiarize themselves with this technology." End quote. So, I mean, I think it's significant. Back channel talks telling Russia they don't want to fight them directly. At least that's going on. I know the last article was all doom and gloom, but this maybe is a hopeful sign. I don't know. But I'm happy Will picked this up because I did not see it, and it was from Wednesday. Lavrov said a lot of stuff on Wednesday, so I'm happy that Will found this. Okay, so the next one here, another thing that Lavrov said on Wednesday that wasn't so good is that he's warning that Russia is going to disrupt Western arms supplies. They have new plans to disrupt these weapon shipments. And this signals that Russia is going to start targeting even more Ukrainian infrastructure. He said that strikes on railway lines, bridges, and tunnels are being considered, and Russia has been pounding Ukrainian energy infrastructure since October, leaving millions of Ukrainians without power and heat for the winter. It's a really horrible situation for the civilians in Ukraine that are suffering from this. But Lavrov's comments suggest that Russia is going to be hitting other types of infrastructure as well, so ramping up that aspect of the war. And Lavrov said that the strikes on the energy grid have helped disrupt supply of the weapons to some point, but he says that more is going to be done in that regard. And Lavrov and other Russian officials have stressed that more U.S. and other Western military aid is going to escalate and drag out the war. And this is, I think, an example of it. It's just going to get worse for the Ukrainians as the U.S. is escalating aid. And on Thursday, Russia launched another barrage on Ukraine's power grid, striking targets with missiles and drones. And Ukrainian officials suggested that it was one of the heaviest Russian barrages in the war, writing on Twitter that Russia has been saving its most massive missile attacks since the beginning of the war for the last days of the year. And that was the Ukrainian Defense Ministry that said that. So, it's just a bad situation for the Ukrainians. And Russia's barrages on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, they began after the truck bombing of the Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. So it's an escalation in response to attacks on Russian territory, is why. And we've seen more Ukrainian drone attacks inside Russia. So it's just going to be more and more escalation as we go on here. And the next article, Belarus shoots down a stray Ukrainian air defense missile. So on Thursday, Belarusian authorities said that they shot down a stray Ukrainian air defense missile from an S-300 system that ended up in its territory, and they summoned Ukraine's envoy over the incident. So the missiles were downed in a field in Belarus's southwestern Brest region. Local authorities, they really downplayed the incident. They said everything's fine, but this is the first known time that a Ukrainian missile ended up in Belarus since the war started, and it came as Russian missiles and drones were pounding Ukrainian infrastructure. Belarus's foreign ministry said that it demanded an investigation into the incident. According to Al Jazeera, a spokesman for Ukraine's military appeared to acknowledge that it was a Ukrainian missile and said the incident was nothing strange and something that has happened more than once. So if you remember, back in November, a Ukrainian S-300 missile hit a farm in Poland, killing 2 people. When the missile strike was first reported, Zelensky and his top aides portrayed it as a Russian attack, and they demanded that NATO take action. If you remember, Ukraine was given help from an unnamed U.S. intelligence official who told the Associated Press that the missile that hit Poland was Russian. But President Biden later said the missile was not Russian, and Poland and NATO publicly said it came from Ukraine. So we have to remember what Zelensky was asking to do when he probably knew full well that it was a Ukrainian air defense missile. He's asking for direct NATO involvement in the war. And in response to this false leak from this U.S. intelligence official, AP fired a reporter. And I remember, based on Slack conversations that were released, didn't really seem like it was the reporter's fault. It seems like his editors didn't do their due diligence. But anyway, they fired the reporter, but they still protected the identity of the source. We would really like to know who it was that gave him that information. All right, so next one here. The State Department approves a $180 million arms sale for Taiwan. So the State Department approved this deal on Wednesday, and it is for vehicle-launched volcano anti-tank mines and related equipment. So they get the munitions and some vehicles that these mines can be launched from. And the primary contractors are Northrop Grumman, who I believe they make the munitions, and the Oshkosh Corporation, who make the vehicles. So the potential sale, it comes after Biden signed the NDAA, which includes $10 billion in loans for Taiwan to buy U.S.-made arms that will be dispersed over 5 years. This is unprecedented military aid for Taiwan. And of course, China is very opposed to this. They're very opposed to these new arms sales. And I read in the South China Morning Post, I meant to add this to the article, but I forgot to. They quoted analysts who basically said, this shows that the Biden administration doesn't really care about repairing relations with China. There's still going to be escalating support for Taiwan. This weapon sale, they meant. And that on top of the new aid, it just shows that, as the U.S. says, their talks with China are about managing tensions, managing the competition. They're not about really resolving issues. They're full steam ahead on increasing support for Taiwan. China is very opposed to this, and they launched new major drills around Taiwan in response to Biden signing the NDAA. All right, the next one here, this is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. A U.S. warplane reports an unsafe encounter with a Chinese jet. So the Pentagon released a video showing a Chinese fighter jet flying near an American RC-135 Rivet Joint Reconnaissance plane. The Pentagon claims the incident occurred in the skies over the South China Sea. So they said this occurred on December 21st over the South China Sea. They said it came within a PLA fighter pilot performed an unsafe maneuver. They say it came within 20 feet of the nose of the U.S. Spy plane. So the important thing to note here is that, the U.S. flies a lot of spy planes over the South China Sea and the East China Sea, very close to China's coast around Taiwan. And they've really increased these flights in recent years, and it really increases the risk of an accident. And we have to always put the shoe on the other foot. Imagine if Chinese spy planes were all over, I don't know, the Gulf of Mexico and around Puerto Rico or something like that, near Cuba even. The U.S. would not be happy about that. And Kyle and Connor Freeman also co-authored this too. They put in some numbers that last year the U.S. flew over 2,000 sorties in these waters: South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Yellow Sea. That's a lot. And it was a major increase in previous years. Now, I think the numbers sort of declined recently after Pelosi visited Taiwan and China really stepped up its military presence. The U.S. backed down a little, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're increasing this again. And we have to think, I mean, if there was an accident here, a collision, and an American pilot died or something, with the state of U.S.-China relations, that could spiral into something bad very quickly. Back in 2001, a Chinese plane collided with an American plane near Hainan Island, which is on the South China Sea. It's a Chinese province. It's not disputed or anything. It was off the coast of that island. And the Bush administration, settled it pretty quickly, but I just can't imagine that could turn into something, in the state of things, how they are right now between the U.S. and China. So it's always a risk. All right, the next article here, U.S. Central Command says that U.S. troops killed 686 suspected ISIS members in 2022. So it's a pretty big number for a country that Biden claims is not at war in the Middle East anymore. So CENTCOM, they released this end of the year report, and it said U.S. troops carried out 313 missions in Iraq and Syria against ISIS, killing 686 suspected members of the terrorist group. Breaking it down by country, the command said that U.S. troops participated in 108 partnered operations with the SDF, that's the Kurdish group that the U.S. backs in Syria, and 14 unilateral missions in Syria that killed, so they killed the bulk of them in Syria. They killed 466, what they call ISIS operatives. And then over in Iraq, the U.S. took part in 191 partnered operations with the Iraqi government, which killed 220 ISIS operatives. So the biggest battle took place at a prison in al-Hasaka in northeast Syria. It holds thousands of ISIS fighters. Fighting ensued after an attempted prison breakout, and this was a huge battle. This was back in January, almost a year ago. The U.S. gave air support to SDF fighters on the ground. There's reports at the time that U.S. troops were also fighting on the ground. And according to CENTCOM, just in that battle, more than 420 suspected ISIS members and 120 SDF fighters were killed. So it was a big battle. Most of the ISIS deaths here. But I think a lot of people that were killed were not ISIS fighters, because this prison held there's about 850 children being held hostage in the prison by ISIS, and at least 2 were killed as a result of the battle, according to the New York Times. But this was not mentioned by CENTCOM, of course. And other reports from eyewitnesses put the number of children killed higher. A 17-year-old Australian boy who was in the prison at the time of the battle told Human Rights Watch that he estimated 15 to 20 children were killed. The boy said that he was injured by a U.S. Apache helicopter strike. And CENTCOM, they offered no estimate. They didn't even try of civilian casualties that were killed as a result of this battle or any of its operations. We know that in one U.S. Special Forces raid in Syria against an ISIS leader in February, civilians were reported killed, and this was confirmed by the Pentagon. Some reports said that up to 6 children were killed and 4 women. President Biden said that the raid was successful because it allegedly killed an ISIS leader, the leader of ISIS at the time, Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Quraishi. He replaced Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as the leader of ISIS, who was killed in a similar raid back in 2019. So it doesn't matter that civilians died. It's still a success. And back in July, I just had to mention that President Biden falsely claimed that U.S. troops are no longer involved in combat operations in the Middle East. And here you have all these raids and drone strikes against ISIS. So he just lied about that. Or I don't know who wrote that for him, but why just such a blatant lie? Besides the U.S. operations in Iraq and Syria, Biden told Congress recently that U.S. troops are also deployed in Yemen to conduct operations against al-Qaeda. And also, the U.S. is also backing the Saudi coalition in Yemen, which has given support to Al Qaeda. So, it's a whole mess. It's a real encapsulation of U.S. foreign policy, backing a coalition that supports Al Qaeda while fighting Al Qaeda. I mean, it's just a mess. But anyway, the next one here, President Biden says that he's looking forward to working with the new Netanyahu government. So this is from Al Jazeera. They're usually have pretty good on Israel. So we just ran this. I didn't have time to write this today. So Netanyahu's new government was sworn in, and President Biden said that he looks forward to working with this new government, ignoring concerns about the inclusion of far-right Israeli politicians accused of racism in the new cabinet. And Biden called Netanyahu his friend for decades in a statement on Thursday, saying that he will cooperate with the Israeli government to jointly address challenges in the Middle East, including, of course, threats from Iran. Biden, again, as I mentioned yesterday, this isn't just pro-Palestinian people, Zionists saying, watch out for this new government. A lot of people inside Israel, people inside the Israeli military are worried about this. Biden's ready to work with them. And again, they said they're going to prioritize settlement expansion, slow annexation of the West Bank. It's just bad news for the Palestinians. But I'm sure Biden's going to continue giving them billions of dollars in military support each year, and probably say some things about how they don't like settlements, but they're not going to, cut aid or anything like that. All right. So the next one, Serbia has ended its state of alert for its military as the standoff in Kosovo eases. I think tensions are still going to remain pretty high up there in northern Kosovo, where the ethnic Serbs are. But at least it seems like there's not going to be any imminent military intervention, any military clashes or anything, because Serbia, they put their military on high alert earlier this week, saying that they were ready to intervene to protect the ethnic Serbs. But now the Serbs have began dismantling roadblocks that they erected in Kosovo. And Kosovo also reopened a border crossing with Serbia that it had closed over the tensions. And the roadblocks, the ethnic Serbs, they erected them after a former ethnic Serb police officer was arrested, and also over Kosovo stepping up its police presence in the north. Kosovo is mostly ethnic Albanian, and I believe the police that they deploy are Albanian, and there's a lot of ethnic tensions there. And the Serbs don't recognize the government of Kosovo, the government in Pristina, as much of the world doesn't. This country was carved out of Serbia after the 1999 NATO bombing campaign, and there's been tensions ever since in the north here, but things have really got tense in recent months. And of course, Serbia is an ally of Russia, but they also kind of look to the West. They want to join the EU and all that. So, but it's still an area to keep an eye on, always a potential flashpoint. With NATO is there, they have a presence, they back the government in Pristina, which I think probably emboldens them to do a little more against these Serbs in the north. But anyway, it looks like things are easing for now, which is good. And the last article here, this is from Will Porter again at the Libertarian Institute. These guys have been doing a lot over there, and it's really helpful. South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol has vowed more aggressive retaliation to military action by Pyongyang, calling to punish North Korea soon after, this came soon after Seoul unveiled a new $440 million military spending package. So briefing reporters following a meeting between the president and South Korea's National Security Office on Wednesday, Yoon's press secretary Kim Ain-hye said officials were instructed to react forcefully to any future provocations, citing a major breach of South Korea's airspace by North Korean drones earlier this week. So they want to punish North Korea for similar provocations. And these drones that they flew five drones. The North flew 5 drones into South Korea, and they remained in Seoul's airspace for up to 7 hours. And some flew over the capital, and they couldn't shoot them down. And Yoon was very upset, the president. He reportedly berated the defense minister, and they apologized for not being able to shoot them down. So he's not happy about that. And so tensions just continue to rise on the Korean Peninsula. I don't think Joe Biden's going to do anything to ease them. Anyway, that's it for the news. I know that was a lot, but there's a lot of stuff here. There's a lot of stuff to go over. Go check out our viewpoints. We have a great one from Ray McGovern about how Biden reneged and now the Russian army will talk. About Sergei Lavrov recently said if Ukraine isn't demilitarized and neutral and isn't neutral like Russia wants, then the Russian army is going to have to deal with that. So again, it's just another sign of this war dragging on. We have a really good one from David Stockman about why the war party needed to demonize Iran. One line he has in here at the beginning that is great is that the very idea that Tehran is an expansionist power bent on exporting terrorism to the rest of the world is a giant fiction and tissue of lies invented by Washington, the Washington War Party, and its Bibi Netanyahu branch in order to win political support for their confrontationist policies. So just a great little summary of what the article is about. One from Doug Banda about getting out of Syria over at Responsible Statecraft, and one from Jim Bovard at the Libertarian Institute about the FBI, and a lot about their collusion with Twitter to suppress accounts and stuff like that. Okay, well, that's it for me for today. That's it for me for the year. If you listen to this on Friday and you're feeling generous, you can make a donation to us so that you could write it off on your 2022 tax return. So support us, antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe. Share the show. Get this. We got to get people more informed. I know, it's rarely good news that I go over, and it can be pretty disheartening to listen to all this. But I think really what we have to do is just get more people informed and more people opposed to these reckless policies. But anyway, Happy New Year. We'll be back with the show on Monday. And I'll talk to you then. Thanks for listening.